Hi, everyone. I am Cynthia Morton. I am one of the co-coordinators of the online peer mediation platform, and I would just really like to share what our platform is about so that you know that we actually are a real live entity that provides training, provides research, provides resources for conflict resolution programs and peer mediation programs. So if you will, I would like to just share very quickly a little bit about our website and see if we can get that going. Okay, here's our website. Our website is the Online Peer Mediation Platform. And just a little bit about us, we were funded by the JAMS Foundation in 2014 to create a platform to provide training, to provide role play practice for peer mediation programs, to provide basic conflict resolution modules for programs that maybe did not have training for their peer mediation students. And also, and one of our future goals is to provide peer mediation for schools that don't have peer mediation. We also have other things that we do besides provide those four things. So on the About Us, I just want to kind of point out that we also provide a 32-hour peer mediation coordinator training online. We also provide organizational conflict resolution training to businesses and organizations. We provide teacher-student mediation training. And also we have a mediator mentor training for college students so that we can mentor high school and middle school students. That we have a team. I just will show you our team members. We have a vast team of experts in conflict resolution, and Pris has joined us this year, and we're so happy to have Pris aboard this year. And Pris has, Priscilla Prutzman has graciously decided to do a webinar for us today to talk about the peer mediation standards, and Pris was part of the group that wrote those standards. So without further ado, Pris, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thanks for joining. So what I'm going to do is give a little bit of a background of the history of the peer mediation standards and then move into the current standards. So basically, peer mediation started in the mid-'80s, and the two main groups that were doing it were community boards out of San Francisco. I believe they're still doing peer mediation, and Creative Response to Conflict did quite a bit in the mid-'80s as well. And there suddenly became this flurry of interest in peer mediation. There literally were hundreds of peer mediation programs within that period of time up until really the mid 90s and late 90s, really, and into 2000. So the National Association of Mediation in Education was the group that did the original peer mediation standards. And I have a copy of it in front of me, and I just wanted to acknowledge those original people who worked on that. Patricia Barnes from the Westchester, New York Mediation Center, Joyce Carson from California, Nancy Howard, then from Minnesota, I think she's moved, myself, Ivan Roy from Canada, Joe Vigil from Albuquerque, New Mexico, Faye Wampler from Virginia, and Liz Wally from Dallas, Texas. So that was the original crew. And we spent several years on this and several meetings coming up with this original standards. And it included definitions, what coordinators would do. And they used the term, or I should say we used the term back then, levels 1, 2, and 3 for training. So like a level 1 trainer had just had, a basic mediation training, and a level 2 had been through some kinds of co-facilitation, and a level 3 had either written some materials for peer mediation or had done several peer mediation trainings. So that's how they categorized it in the beginning, and I'll mention later on how that changed. And what was included in both documents was what conflict is, and all kinds of conflict resolution skills, which I'll go over in a minute too, communication skills, and some of these really remained the same in the newer version, but that would include I statements, definitely active listening, probably one of the most important tools for peer mediation. Oh, Lauren Waybright joined. Hi, Lauren. That's great. And it also included ongoing mediation training that would include more advanced training on topics like bias awareness or bullying prevention and intervention, and other topics as they came up, depending on the age level as well. So then the National Association of Mediation in Education was one of the groups that merged to form the Association for Conflict Resolution, and I actually was the representative from for education for that. And so that was an amazing process too, merging an education group, merging a group which focused more on legal and lawyer mediation, and the counselors, the AFM, Association of Family Mediators. So those were the three groups, NIDER and SPIDER, NAME, and AFM, were the three groups that merged into form the current Association for Conflict Resolution. And that happened really early on in the next decade, really, in the 2000. I don't even remember what the actual founding date. Do you remember, Cindy? It might have been, I would say 2000, right in that area. 2000.
Before my time, I know that.
So ACR formed an education section, which ended up creating the newer version of the standards for peer mediation. And basically, they added the amount of time that was required or recommended, I should say. And there was early on, and this carried over into ACR, a discussion about the difference between standards and guidelines. Some of us wanted to use the term guidelines because it was actually, more open-ended, and standards. We ended up choosing the term standards because we really wanted to move the field ahead. And at that original time, the Hewlett Foundation funded mediation programs and mediation manuals really all over the country, including community boards and creative response to conflict. So they were very, very instrumental in bringing peer mediation and conflict resolution education into the public. When we first started out, mediation was often confused with meditation. People literally did not know what mediation was. So by the end of the funding of the Hewlett Foundation, mediation was a household term, and it was definitely being used. So Association for Conflict Resolution got much more detailed. Basically, they increased the hours for the training by at least 2 for each age group. Okay, so the original training, there was a lot of discussion about this because there were parts of the country where they just couldn't come up with that kind of time, or either financially or time to take away from student learning. So the original thing was elementary school training was 12 to 16 hours, and that was moved to 18 hours for elementary. And the original middle school was 12 to 16, and that was moved to 18 also. And high school was moved up to 22 hours. It was originally 15 to 20 hours. And then the follow-up was originally 2 to 10 hours, and that got moved up to over 12 hours plus. And that's where, the additional multicultural training, bias awareness training, all kinds of bullying prevention work got added. And of course, now the mediation is in a huge upsurge right now because of restorative practice. Because there was a period when peer mediation programs came to a screeching halt, really because of the standards movement, where people, did not want to they saw mediation as an extracurricular activity. They wanted to focus on math and English. and not social and emotional learning. Now, in the last 5 to 7 years or so, depending on what part of the country you're in, there's a huge influence and interest in restorative practices and restorative justice. CRC uses the term restorative practices because we like to leave it open and include lots of different ways of using restorative. Was a lot of what we were doing in the beginning of group building and affirmation is very much part of the beginning of community building and restorative practices. So it's actually very, very similar. So the goals of starting a peer mediation program are really important. You need to think about, what are you trying to accomplish? What's important for you? Are you really looking to teach everybody conflict resolution and peer mediation skills, or are you looking to have a smaller cohort of peer mediators? So this is one of the things that the newer standards gets into. What are the needs of the school? Is it a really large school? I think back to one of my original elementary schools, PS 230, we had 100 mediators at one point, and we developed a interpreter program because there were over like 40 languages that were spoken in that school. So there were anywhere from 20 to 40 interpreters, and I think we got up to 12 languages at one point. So mediations would take place in those other languages. So does anyone have any questions so far, or any comments?
Chris, I do have one question
Sure.
for you. So I know when I am training schools about peer mediation, and we go into negotiation about, I'm going to come in, I'm going to train your students.
Mm-hmm.
There's this real big pushback about how many hours, they can give me, as you said.
Yeah.
So let's say a school is really wanting a peer mediation program, but the administration is like, oh, okay, I can only give you so many hours. What would be your professional opinion about how they can get all their hours in? What's the minimum hours you suggest? So if someone's watching this, I think that would be great for them to hear how that would work.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking your question is a great question, and I'm thinking back to Bill Kreidler, who wrote a great article called "Does Your School Really Need a Peer Mediation Program?" And what he was talking about in that article really was, you need, if you're really going to take advantage fully of peer mediation, the school needs to be ready for it. There needs to be a commitment to nowadays restorative practices would do it, but there needs to be enough staff training in what conflict resolution is. And I mean, I think the original standards of that I just mentioned before, of those hours are pretty accurate in terms of the baseline of what is needed. On the other hand, and people have very different opinions about this. Some people do not want to go into a school unless they're completely ready and they agree to do 3 days of training plus ongoing support, which could be another 2 to 3 days throughout the year. That's the ideal, when principals and teachers realize the importance of this and realize how this is going to actually help their teaching and help the whole school have a much better climate. So there isn't really any one answer to that. And personally, I think that any kind of training that teachers or the schools get is good, because you never know what it's going to lead to. It could lead to the very best complete program that you've ever had, or it could go nowhere. You really don't know. So, but there are a lot of people who feel we shouldn't even begin to do it unless there's a total commitment. I think the original idea was that they commit to at least 3 days of training. And the new standards suggest that, and that they have a person in the school who is a coordinator and who takes responsibility for making sure the scheduling goes well, making sure that they're actually doing mediation and that their skills are up to speed, and who might run ongoing problem-solving sessions for the peer mediators to make sure that they're improving all the time. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but it's a great question, and it's really a question for dialogue, because each school is different. The goals of peer mediation are very different. Years ago, we did a program in peer mediation in what was then called a junior high in New York City, and virtually 90% of the students were in trouble 90% of the time. So we did a peer mediation program simply to raise their self-esteem. We didn't really care how many conflicts they solved. They got this training, they felt special, and it really accomplished that goal of improving the climate from a very different perspective. Most schools, their goal is really to be able to solve conflicts so that teachers have more time to teach. I mean, I think that's really, the deans are, depending on the size of the school, the deans will have more time to deal with, really serious conflicts. And that's another area that the standards booklet goes into. What is mediatable and what is not mediatable? That's another area for a lot of discussion. But the school itself has to decide that. Generally speaking, anything in very serious conflict involving weapons or drugs, serious fighting does not go to mediation in most schools. Even the most advanced schools that are using restorative practices and include peer mediation as part of their restorative practices, they don't usually use that either. So, however, the deans and the people dealing with this more serious conflict are using different forms of mediation. And then there's the issue of the discussion, which is an ongoing discussion of power imbalance in mediation. That's a really, really big thing too. A lot of people think that any form of bullying, it does not go to mediation. But other schools feel that beginning levels of bullying could possibly go to mediation in some cases, as long as there's some way of overcoming the power imbalance. I don't know if anybody wants to weigh in on that subject at this point, because that's a big discussion for peer mediation programs. Do you have anything on that, Cindy?
I don't want to weigh in on the power balance, but I wanted to reiterate your comment about how willing the school is, is the school ready, and does the school really want it? I've been working for 10 years now abroad in schools with general teacher training, trying to get them out of the textbook and into the classroom and into the world with their practical learning and so on. And until recently, so I had 10 years of doing this, and the last 2 years only have I found a school by myself that is continuing the training after I've gone. I'm only there a couple of weeks, and then I leave, and then I come back a couple of weeks, 6 months later. But in between times, I do video, Skype videos, 1 hour lessons with them as a catch up. And then they show me, I have a documentation system set up so that they show me what they've been doing in their classroom, practicing the things that we were doing online. Mm-hmm. There's the old light bulb joke. How many schools, so we're talking about peer mediator trainers. How many trainers do you need to change the school and to change the light bulb? Well, you only have to have one, but the light bulb has to really want to change. There's the whole story. The only reason that I can work in this school is because the principal really wants to do this. And I found that out the first visit. I didn't require that they had, that they were going to give me 3 days of training or I wouldn't set foot in the door. No, no, the requirement is very simple. Do you really want to do this? And how are you going to do it? And how are you going to, 3 things. What's your goal? What do you want to do? How do you think you want to do it? And how can you tell that you did it?
Mm-hmm.
That's it. If I get that commitment, then I'm willing to give my time.
Yeah. Yeah. So you would be in the category of not doing peer mediation training until the school is really ready for it.
That's part of the training is to get them ready for it.
Yeah. Right. Right. So let's see. So there's a lot of different, it's important to mention that there's lots of different types of mediation, and that most school programs are facilitative types of mediation. They're not usually transformative, although there are a few areas in the country that do peer mediation using a transformative model. And the transformative model is a little bit closer to a restorative model, and sometimes restorative schools that are big with restorative practices might use a transformative model of mediation, particularly the older grades in high school. You might find some of those. But most elementary and middle school peer mediation programs, even if they have restorative programs, tend to be more problem-solving, facilitative types of mediation rather than transformative or narrative. But it's important to mention that in the training so that people realize that, you know, mediation is a big field and it could be done in many different ways. And I think that's one of the good things about mediation is there's only one way to do it. There's lots of different ways to do it. And when you look at who's going to be trained, some schools have the entire student body is trained in peer mediation tools. I know of a school that used to do peer mediation as a gifted and talented model, so that they looked at it as being able to mediate and help others solve their problems was a gift. So they, you know, that would be a separate class for a gifted and talented program. And other schools would have it taught as part of their social studies. I think Teaneck, New Jersey, years ago chose to do that. They had one semester, a whole semester long of peer mediation training that everybody who went through that school got you know, a whole semester worth of peer mediation. And there's some schools now in New York City where they are making peer mediation classes, and part of the class is actually doing the peer mediation, and students get credit for it, which is, you know, another model, a way of doing it. The content must include, you know, the basic issues of conflict resolution, you know, win-win or fair solutions. We sometimes use that term. Looking at positions and needs and interests, that's important, especially for the older students. Basic conflict resolution skills are woven throughout the training. Basic communication skills are lots and lots of practice with different kinds of listening, whether it's just listening, whether it's listening and paraphrasing, or listening and active listening, where they have to really identify more what the feelings are, and it is a much harder skill, really. So we might spend a whole day just on communication skill building, and, you know, pointing out to the mediators that we're really not doing a mediation unless we're really doing active listening and really understanding what the conflicts are. And you know, with adult mediation and peer mediation, one of the hardest things to get over is the idea of not wanting to jump in and solve the problem. I'm sure you've experienced that. It takes a lot of practice to not jump in and say, oh, well, you know, I know of a conflict and that's what they did, you know, to really wait till they come up with their solution and they really feel comfortable about choosing the solution. And then the advanced training, some schools, most of the schools that we're in have a large cultural diversity in them, which is great. And we can learn more about the different cultures that are in the school and learn different ways of listening. Some cultures feel comfortable just kind of being close up and direct eye contact constantly. And other cultures, maybe looking at the person and looking away might be more appropriate ways of listening. So we cover that actually usually in the beginning part of the training, if there's any kind of diversity in the school, which there usually is. The bullying, again, is it's important for students to be able to identify what bullying is. In New York State, we now have the Dignity for All Students Act, where all teachers have to receive at least a day of bullying training. And also, interestingly enough, in New York State, they have changed the definition of bullying to say that it can be a one-time event. So a lot of our original materials of training say, in order for it to be bullying, it has to be, intent to harm and something that involves a repetition. But that's not the case anymore. That's really changed, and that's fairly recent too. So we need to look at what that means in terms of peer mediation as well. If it is a one-time event and it's not that serious, and both parties are willing to mediate, perhaps that could be done in a mediation context. Personally, I think maybe doing a restorative circle might be a better choice, even if it's a little bit of bullying, because it's really hard for us to fully know how the student is feeling. It might not be obvious to us. So, using restorative circles where the power is more equally distributed among the people and trying to solve the problem, or trying to, in restorative language, trying to repair the harm. Again, there's so almost every restorative program that I'm aware of is also wanting to add peer mediation. And interestingly enough, they don't usually add the peer mediation until 2 or 3 years into the restorative program. They rarely start out with the peer mediation. And that process actually takes care of all those other issues of, is the school ready, to do mediation? And it's just a natural extension of the program. Let's see, where else we need to go. We talked about the models where everybody could be trained, or just a group, or a combination, of that. Ideally, the peer mediation gets put into the discipline policy, or whatever it's called in the school. Some schools call it a code of conduct. And that's really, really good to very clearly state within your school's discipline code or code of conduct what goes to mediation, what is mediatable. And usually that involves property disputes, friendship disputes, that kind of conflict that we have practiced basically in our peer mediation. More serious and more repeated conflict might go to a different process, hopefully restorative practice. Any comments on that so far? Okay.
That's great, Chris.
Okay, and the model that most peer mediation programs use is a co-mediation model, which is a very interesting decision. And the reason for that is that you have people that can relate to different types of of people, and so they might be more comfortable. Also, if the mediator gets a little nervous at some point, the other mediator can step in and take over. So co-mediation is a really great model. Not every adult mediation program adopts that model. Sometimes there's just one mediator, and sometimes there's more than two mediators too. But in school mediation, it's almost always a co-mediation model, and it contributes to the climate of the school being more cooperative and more positive, as well as, you know, relying on different people's skills and relating to different types of people well. So that's another thing that comes up is mediation involving adults or teachers. That's also another big issue. Some schools don't feel that peer mediators should do any mediation with adults, and other schools feel that, usually the more advanced programs feel that they could do mediations between students and teachers. So that's something that people need to decide, and it is a, you know, kind of a higher level. Let's see. The school, the selection of mediators. Again, the school needs to relate how they choose the mediators to the goals of the program. Usually there's a belief that the peer mediator should reflect the diversity of the school community, and so that there should be any mediator should be available to relate to a certain type of student or cultural group of student. So we often, in choosing mediators, try to make sure that ends up happening, and that often ends up meaning that there's more mediators. So that could include age level, their ethnic background, gender, even sexual orientation, language ability, their academic standing, social economic status. All kinds of differences should be reflected in the mediators, so that if students have a conflict, they feel comfortable going to at least one of the mediators. So that's that's important. Now, how to choose mediators is also another thing that people do a lot of discussions on. Some schools have it be voluntary. Some schools, particularly in high school, you sign up for a course. Other schools have a model of choosing where students nominate peer mediators, and then it goes through a process of being vetted by teachers and other students. We sometimes do a process called sociocratic decision making, where students can nominate other students, and they have to say why that person would make a good mediator. So the advantage of that, even though it's way time consuming, the advantage of that process is you would go around to every classroom and say, what are the qualities of a mediator? You know, a mediator can maintain confidentiality, which is always a really important part of peer mediation. They're a good listener. They don't gossip. They would list all the good qualities of a mediator, and then the class would actually nominate people in the class, and if then it would go through a process where the end result is that nobody objects to these people. Then those names would be given to a teacher group and finally the administrators, and that's how the final group would be chosen. We usually, Lauren, you wanted to add?
I like that model where the students are involved in the selection.
Yes, I think that's very important.
More skin in the game. The more skin in the game for everybody, including teachers. Get as many teachers involved. That's why two mediators are important to have, especially in the schools, is that you've got lots, because it spreads the wealth.
Yeah. And we usually try to recommend that the more people, the better, you know, in choosing. But that doesn't always happen in a school. Oftentimes the school, you know, basically just assigns students. They might be in the honor society, or they might be, you know, in a peer leadership program. That sometimes happens partly because of lack of time, and partly because of their vision of what the program is, what the goals are. You know, and again, that goes back to, you know, is this to improve self-esteem? Is this to improve school climate? Is this to reduce conflict? Is this to reduce suspensions? What are the goals of what's the school trying to accomplish? And that often leads itself to choosing a method of choosing mediators that that relates to the goals. So, and I think that's a really important part of it. Because I have seen programs in schools where, you know, they have a great restorative program, and the mediation program isn't quite as vibrant as the restorative part of it. You know, the restorative might be advisory lessons every or sessions every week. And they may have, you know, maybe 10 mediations in the whole school year, which is pretty low, you know. And other schools who may not be as involved with restorative practices may have hundreds of peer mediations throughout. So it really varies from school to school, and also, you know, the size of a school. Another thing that's often helpful for peer mediation programs is to have benefits for the peer mediators. On the one hand, they have to maintain their academic standing, so that's in very clearly written in the ACR standards. That mediators are generally they have to be suspended if they're failing a course, or even not getting, you know, good grades in a course. And that's a way of bringing teachers into the buy-in of the program, because the teachers don't want to, you know, sacrifice their teaching time for, you know, for peer mediation. So that's an important issue, I think. So back to the content. In conflict, students need to end up being able to define conflict and benefits of conflict resolution. They need to look at different styles of conflict and conflict resolution styles. They need to describe different types of conflict. They need to be able to recognize different points of view. They need to be able to identify bias in communications. And they need to be able to use some kind of prejudice reduction or responding to biased comments within their contact. And they need to be able to understand power and inequity in relationships. And if they notice that, they need to basically change that. And they need to talk about, as they get more advanced with understanding bias, they need to talk about what are strategies for equalizing power. And they need to recognize that different cultural groups might look at conflict very, very differently. It might be a cultural thing to really avoid conflict, to avoid saving, you know, to not put someone down, or to save face. So that might be a cultural issue as well. And of course, identifying what's going to go to peer mediation. That would be part of the training as well. And then under the communication skills, looking at why effective communication is important, describing nonverbal communication. That can be a really important part of a mediation. Identifying good and poor listening skills. We talked about active listening skills, using I messages, paraphrasing, clarifying questions, reflecting questions, reframing. Those are all things that need to be part of the training. And as well as encouraging listening for feelings and being able to identify feelings. For some of the elementary programs, that's a really important beginning part. What are the feelings that you might see in a mediation, and be able to identify them? And of course, the cultural diversity in terms of styles of communication and negotiation. So for the mediation skills, students need to be able to be able to define mediation, to be able to talk about preliminary assumptions like voluntary participation, confidentiality, neutrality, and really understand those and be able to state those in the beginning of a mediation. To be able to clearly state ground rules and to be able to apply the ground rules. A lot of, in practice mediation, when we do training, a lot of times we have to really teach assertiveness to be able to say, remember you agreed not to put the other person down, or remember you agreed not to interrupt. And that is a way to enable the mediation to continue. Otherwise, it will just escalate out of control, and nobody will be able to solve anything because of the ground rules or the whatever you choose to call those. Sometimes we call them guidelines, sometimes ground rules. The peer mediator really does need to learn assertiveness skills as well. And sometimes we have very shy children that are chosen to be mediators because they never get into conflict, but they're really off. We have to teach them to be assertive enough to really do the mediation. I've often felt actually that a great peer mediator is somebody who likes acting because they're able to project their, what they're trying to do really clearly, and that some of our best mediators are also great actors and actresses. So let's see, they need to be able to clearly say what the steps of mediation are, both in terms of what they are and in terms of what they would actually say. So in the peer mediation training, we go over it from both perspectives. They need to understand what the conflict is. They need to understand different points of view and be able to identify that, identify positions and interests, to guide disputants to gathering options and do, continue to do brainstorming and be able to facilitate brainstorming in a healthy way, because sometimes people do brainstorming really quickly and they don't wait and pause. And sometimes the most creative ideas come out after the pause. And that's something that we talk about in the training. Being able to help people choose a resolution when there might be very different points of view about what the resolution should be. That's an important skill for a mediator. And then there's the issue of writing the agreement. And this is different with different age levels. Sometimes elementary programs don't even use written agreements. They just kind of use a checkoff sheet, because for elementary, it can take longer to write the agreement than to do the mediation sometimes because it goes so quickly, And then in high school, it really is an important skill to be able to write down the agreement. And so we need to take a lot of time to practice making a good agreement and look at what is a good agreement. Is it equal on both sides? Do both people feel equally empowered? And then in middle school, it might be a combination of a checkoff and a shorter version of a written agreement. And these are time things, because a lot of times in elementary school, the peer mediation is happening during lunchroom, and the mediators are walking around with mediator t-shirts looking for business, as they say. So they might not, and then they would go to a quiet area, but there would always be a teacher or a staff member or whoever is the mediation coordinator nearby to help out in case they can't really finish mediation or in case they need help. And in middle school, it could be a combination of looking for conflict in a cafeteria or recess time, and then go to a room that might be designated. And generally, high school mediations have a room that is designated for the mediation, and they generally, the adult staff member is, close to it, but not actually in the room. That's usually the way that the high school mediation runs. Any comments or questions at this point so far?
No, everything sounds good to me.
Lauren, you had one?
Yes. In the elementary schools, do they have teachers? How often do they have teachers in on the mediation? Or do they try not to have them? What is the situation?
In elementary schools, well, in any of the age levels, there would be an adult who understands mediation nearby.
Nearby, yeah.
Nearby, yeah. They would, even in elementary peer mediation programs, the adult would not be in the mediation. They would be able to hear what's going on, but not consciously part of the mediation. That's been our experience. There does need to be somebody there, but not actually in the mediation. That's a good question. Yeah.
That would be important.
Yeah. Then we talked about the hours. Elementary 18, middle 18, high school 20, ongoing 12 plus hours per year. Okay. And in my experience, it's better to do the mediation training kind of as close together as possible. 3 days in a row, or over a 2-week period maybe. But what we're finding is teachers don't want to give up their students more than 1 day a week. So often the training happens in a 3-week period, which isn't the best model. And then there always needs to be a refresher. I'm doing a refresher tomorrow, actually, with last year's mediators, and they need to be kind of practice their skills, basically. And then ongoing training. We talked about bias awareness, cultural competence, dealing with difficult situations, dealing with power issues, problem-solving skills, reflective practice on their own ability as a mediator, having the students do more, be more part of their creating of the program. The empowerment of the student here is really, really important. Ongoing team building for the mediators. I think one of the biggest problems in peer mediation is there aren't enough mediations that happen. So, that needs to be addressed to what are we doing with the peer mediators, and they can continue to refine their skills. They can coach new mediators that come in, and they can, practice all these newer skills. Let's see, what else did we not include? Oh yes, advertising the program. That's a really big thing. After the training and after they have gotten started, they might want to do an assembly on what peer mediation is, what's mediatable, where the mediations will take place. There might be some kind of identifying T-shirt that the mediators wear, or a hat, or however they identify who the mediators are and how to do that. The principal and the teachers need to promote it. Sometimes the student mediators will make signs and posters and put them all over the school. Have you tried mediation? That's a common practice. But to make sure that the school knows that it's there, I think that's really, really important. And make sure that the teachers, the guidance counselors, the deans, whoever promotes it on a regular basis. Let's see. The new standards do talk about what you need to become a trainer of peer mediation, and usually a trainer does have adult mediation experience and training, and as well as practice with training peer mediators, so that they're not just doing this for the first time. It's really good to work with an experienced trainer of peer mediators, and then work into maybe the next year you would be more of a lead trainer. So the education of trainers takes place in different ways too. Sometimes outside groups will have a training just to practice how you would do the training. Personally, I like the idea of going into a school and working with people in the school as co-trainers. And so they see how the mediators are responding. They see who needs what help. They get to practice in the role plays. They get to see the peer mediation process as well as understand the trainers.
I would just second that, Chris. It's really good. Again, it gets more skin in the game. Have a co-trainer from inside the school. Then there's somebody there when you're not there. It's like that coordinator you mentioned before. That's perhaps the most important. Well, the principal has to agree to do it. And then the principal needs to support that coordinator. But that coordinator needs to be in place and really buy into the program. Otherwise.
Yeah, there is all kinds of research out there that the principal being on board moves the program along more quickly and pretty much ensures its success. There are programs that have succeeded without that happening, but it's harder to do. And it takes much longer to do. It's kind of a grassroots. Some of the teachers are interested in it, or parents too. Parents can act as mediation coordinators in a very effective way as long as they have adequate training for it. Then the one other thing that's mentioned in the ACR standards is, what is an advanced practitioner? Okay, that's an important thing to think about. An advanced practitioner basically has all the skills and knowledge of how to train teachers or other practitioners to do the peer mediation. They've developed some kind of expertise in peer mediation, conflict resolution, professional development models, or multicultural education. They've worked with peer mediation programs for at least 5 years. They've designed their own training materials, which could include conference presentations, advanced workshops, like the bias awareness or the bullying prevention and intervention. And they've done a lot of peer mediation training and program coordination themselves. And they've developed an understanding of processes for training and educating student mediators, program coordinators, trainers, and training of trainers or educators of trainers. And they're capable of ongoing monitoring and evaluation of peer mediation programs. So that's how the ACR standards talks about what is advanced practitioner. And the last thing I want to talk about is the sustainability of a program. That's really important. And earlier we talked about the school being committed to doing this for at least 3 years, because it does take a while for the school culture to change. So hopefully it will go on much longer than 3 years. But one of the things I think for sustainability is the quality of the program. Retaining a committed, enthusiastic person to really be the leader of this in the school is really important to sustain it. And they might also try adapting the process to meet the needs of diverse groups, advanced training, community outreach, fundraising for the program. Maybe they want to get fancier t-shirts and maybe jackets. And that, that adds to the positive nature of the program. They want to continue to do in-service presentations to the staff, and they want to integrate conflict resolution concepts and skills into curriculum as well. That really sustains the program. When we use the terms conflict resolution, restorative practices, peer mediation. We use it every day. It's part of the fabric of the school. Going to conferences. One of the middle schools that I work in, we go to at least one conference where we present, and it's really group building to do that. It's inspiring to see young people go to a professional conference and present. I know you've been very involved with that, Cindy, and the ACR Youth Conference days. It's really inspiring to have people do that, and young people are going to learn so much more from the young people anyway, so we might as well get them involved with that. Doing harder and harder mediations is also a way of sustaining it too. Small and large group mediations, special events. Years ago, we used to bring our elementary mediators up to the Eleanor Roosevelt house up at Valkill, and we would hire a lady to dress up as Eleanor Roosevelt and talk about conflict resolution on a worldwide level. And there would be pictures of Khrushchev hanging on the wall in Valkill. And this was a very, very special event where we brought student mediators, and they got to run around at a camp. They brought their bicycles on the bus and could ride anywhere safely. So, really giving special things back to the peer mediators is really important. And if you have the skill and the wherewithal to do teacher-student mediation, that's also another sign of progression. So I think that's all I wanted to say. I don't know if anybody has more comments or more questions or.
I do have one question, Chris. So could you go back to the, let's see where it was at. You were talking about the advanced practitioner.
Yeah.
How could someone, let's say someone has all the criteria, they've met all the things that you talked about. How does one go about getting that designation to be recognized as advanced practitioner?
Well, the ACR has a advanced practitioner process where you can apply and you submit the credentials to that, and then you're listed in your ACR membership as an advanced practitioner.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just to point that out, if someone was really interested in that, how would they go about that? Because I think it would be a great designation. It would look wonderful if you're trying to, really sell yourself as a trainer.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Good. I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah. Thanks. Okay. Well, yeah, I'm go on to prepare my advanced training for tomorrow, which is at a middle school in Queens. So,
Lauren, did you have a question right quick? I think you're muted. I think he's muted. So let me unmute him. Lauren, did you have a question? Because you're muted.
you have to unmute yourself, Lauren.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, there you go.
I know you're going to do a archive of the webinar session today, but is there a way of, Pris, that you giving us your notes or something so that there's something written down?
Well, I actually have taken notes.
Yes.
So
Would you be able to type those up and add them to the chat box or something?
I will. I will actually type these up.
That would be so valuable to the other people. Yes.
Yes, a lot of knowledge. So what I will add, so this will be on YouTube. This will be on our blog on the online peer mediation platform. I will also send it out to any attendees and those who have signed up. I will also send out a copy of the standards. And Chris, there was a request for the Kreidler article. Do you have a copy of that?
I can look for it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It was entitled, "Does Your School Really Need a Peer Mediation Program?"
That would be great.
And this is the original cover. I mean, basically what I did to prepare for this webinar was to review this and compare it to the current ACR standards, which are available on the ACR website. And Bill Waters' website has them on his website as well.
And we have them, we've put them on OPMP website, and there's a University of Maryland. So there's lots of places that have the standards, and we are very appreciative. And Pris, we're very appreciative of you doing this webinar today. So thank you.
I enjoyed
thank
doing it. Thank you for
those that
attending.
that were on today, and those that couldn't be on. We're thinking about those in California
Yes,
today.
thank you, Pris.
All right, so I'll
Thank
stop
you.
recording.
I learned something